It's my privilege and a lifetime opportunity to be with you. And before starting, my salutations to that Vibhutimat, Srimat, Urjita Sattva of Vd Kolhatkar, because he is a Bhagavatam Sambhuta. Of course, my introduction was done with lots of eulogies, but I don't think that I deserve those many of the eulogies. But there are certain facts which I have learned in my life, in the career, and I thought it would be better to share with the younger generation. And whatever I am going to talk may be guided towards the younger generation, not to the seniors who are in the front seat. Sorry for that. Now let me start with the basic issue of a rational Ayurvedic practice. Now, a person, now whenever any person starts the practice, and as I have faced it, now when I started my practice also I have faced almost similar questions. Now of course I am a committed Ayurvedist, but at one stage, at the time of studying after the graduation, I was a rebel. And I never felt that a Ayurvedic practice cannot make a career. That was what I felt. And many of the younger generation students also may be feeling the same. It's quite natural. Reasons are many. But later, of course, you will be learning the realities of the life, and then you know the real value of the Ayurveda when you actually get into the practice. And when you get into the practice, you will face hundreds of problems. It's never possible to list the type of questions and problems together. But I have made a few of those very common questions, like what would be the selection of the right model? Of course, you have plenty of models of practice. It could be a consultation practice. It could be this Panchakarma hospital, surgical hospital, and so on, so many. But at one stage, what I felt, now I am just sharing my experiences. I felt there is a need of one model of Ayurveda which has to reach to the lower class of the society. It's generally felt like Ayurvedic treatment is costly and it is reserved for either higher class, or Ayurvedic treatment is of something like a street side practice, like where herbs are sold over that, and then lots of misperception exists in the society about Ayurvedic practice. And I thought we should have a model which can reach to the people, and it could be competitive. Next, of course, a public acceptance is another of the basic issue for Ayurvedic practitioner. I remember about a day in 1975 when I joined the undergraduate course BAMS. In 1975 we had a strike in Karnataka for 1.5 years, closing all Ayurvedic colleges for 1.5 years. During the time of emergency, we had a strike. And nobody bothered about the strike in the society, among the Ayurvedic colleges. At that time, we had 8 Ayurvedic hospitals. And for 1.5 years, all the hospitals were closed. Somehow, we got an opportunity to meet the health minister of the day. And in that meeting, the health minister asked a question. See, the 8 hospitals are closed throughout the state for 1 year. But there is no public demand from anyone to say that we are suffering. So why the government should bother about it if the public doesn't need it? And that question made me like, either I have to quit this field, or if I have to continue in this field, we have to create a model where the public would be accepting it. Unfortunately or fortunately, I couldn't quit the course due to many other reasons. So I had to continue. Then now, today, after 35 years of practice, I can proudly say that we have a model where even if we close the services for a day, definitely there would be a public demand. So public acceptance would be the ultimate goal for our treatment or our practice. That's what we have to do. When I say public acceptance, again, there are 2 basic issues. Of course, I have a love for Ayurveda. I treat my patients with Ayurvedic treatment. But I would wish that a person should not suffer due to my bias about Ayurveda. We should be in a position to give to a suffering person the best of the available. And this is possible only when you coexist with the current existing clinical system. We cannot deny the existence of the modern system. Modern system I am not criticizing or applauding all the other way. I am not sold off by the modern system also, but you can't rule out the existence of a contemporary system which is efficient, which reaches the public, which has a built better system asset. Competing with that would not be possible, or it's not even the game, your aim also. It's not a competition. But I say it should be a healthy coexistence where the people should be given the best of both the worlds. We have our own treasures. At the same time, modern system also has its own advantages. Disadvantages also are there. There could never be any system which is absolutely perfect. Every system will have its own negatives and its own positives. So we should be in a position to provide the best to the society, and then only there will be a meaning to the profession as such. So my idea was to have a proficiency in the contemporary system, and I always say this: if you have to be a successful Ayurvedic practitioner, you should be more modern than a modern doctor. And that's what I have tried to keep up as far as possible. And that's one of the basic idea of what we have to do. Now, of course, these are the other issues. Another issue which I will be trying to deal with today in the presentation would be which of the medicines to be used, sourcing of the medicines. Of course, financial issues the other way. Of course, Sir has told that I am not charging the patient, I am not making money. Sorry, though I am not charging the patient too much, my charges for the patients where I dispense the medicines, and I don't charge any consultation fees. I dispense the medicines to the patients, and my charges are standard: 30 rupees for 4 days treatment, 70 rupees for 1 week's treatment, 150 rupees for 1 month's treatment. With that, though my looks are not really suggesting it, I keep a low profile, because Sushruta has said a practitioner should be anuddhata veshaha. I am among the top 5 income tax payers in Udupi ITO among the medical fraternity. Of course, that's another issue, because I think I thought I should have corrected that issue, because he said I am not making money. Money is another issue. Financial issues, of course, are a factor, but I don't say finance issues should be the main guiding issues of the practice. You can't just deny that. Of course, at the end, you have to make money, and I always say an Ayurvedic practitioner should exploit Ayurveda. More you exploit Ayurveda, you will be more a committed Ayurvedic practitioner. That's the so I don't have a hesitation to say that I have exploited Ayurveda. And of course, that's what we are really doing it. Next slide, please. Now, the basic issue now, I will focus on the other basic 2 components of the practice: Aushadha Pariksha and Roga Pariksha. These are the only 2 issues I will be dealing with. The other problems, of course, it may not be possible to deal with one session or so on. Now, particularly coming to the basic issue of the medicines, using of the medicines, usually the students face a lots of problems. Like problems is because the problem of plenty. You have lots of yogas. Basic idea of Ayurvedic practice. What is the original Ayurvedic practice? Again, if we go to the Samhitas, Charaka Sushruta Ashtanga, I think I don't have to repeat that to the issues. Virtually, there are very few yogas. Disease-specific yogas are very few. Rather, it's about the Gana Sangraha, group of the drugs which would have a function. Now, ideally, an Ayurvedic, original Ayurvedic practice where Charaka or Sushruta would have done it, would be selecting a few of the drugs which are present in the Gana and preparing a medicine after having the patient, examining the patient. So that's why it's always said, Roga Madhav Pariksheta Tadanantaram Aushadam. But now the situation has changed. Gradually, as the evolution of Ayurveda has occurred, when you go into the next Vaishajya Kalpana, Ratnavali or Sahasra Yoga, etc., you have a combination of yogas where a disease-specific indication is mentioned, and that idea of doshagnata, or that idea is kept in the background. I am not saying that's completely avoided. So there is a sort of evolution. Then comes the development of Rasa Shastra, where it's considered something like a potential specific, target-specific drugs as such. So you have lots of choices and lots of options to be made when you go into Ayurvedic practice. So question comes in, which is Shuddha Ayurvedic practice? The word Shuddha Ayurvedic practice itself is an ambiguous statement. So what is that Shuddhata in that practice? That's another of the question. Now next please. Now, in the present day situation, you have still more of the problems. More than 16,000 yogas are already present in many of those our samhitas which are established. Then innumerable Anubhuta yogas, many Vaidyas, they have tried their own and they have established. All of them are valid. Then you have lots of of course, now central government has prepared an Ayurvedic formulary and this contains about 400 yogas. Then our Ayush ministry has released a list of essential Ayurvedic medicine and it has 277 yogas. And then of course you have lots of patent preparations prepared by many companies with lots of names like Cruel, Step and so on. When our tradition is to have attractive names like Chandraprabha, Suryaprabha, etc., we are now in the level of naming the drugs with Cruel, Step, and next thing is Cruel, Step, the next would be Chappal, which is not there. Now, anyway, this is not to criticize or anything, but this is what we are facing with, and we have lots of issues, problems about that. Then of course you have that single herbal remedies which are practiced by folklore and so on. So it's a problem of plenty. Naturally you will have in the beginning you will have a confusion like which of the drugs or which of these have to be selected. How to make use of your list of medicines as such. Now that's exactly the point which I mentioned, like what Charaka had done was Rogamadav Pariksheta Tadanantaram Aushadam. So it's the Pariksha of the Roga first and then Aushada next. The situation now is we have the Aushada with us and we are searching for a patient who will be fitting to that Aushada. So we are going in a reverse direction. So, and inevitable. You cannot go back to the same days of Charaka or Sushruta. Charaka or Sushruta have considered the Arishta Lakshana with the patient's messengers. Messengers giving the Arishta Lakshana, and during the movement of the physician to the doctor also, some of the Arishta Lakshanas are predicted. That's exactly the practical issue. Practical issue is as you go towards the patient, if in the surroundings, if you are able to identify some of those medicines which could be useful to that patient, then that would be one of the Sadhya Lakshana. If you are not able to see the plants which would be suitable for that patient, that itself would be considered as the Arishta Lakshana. So at that period, the whole perception of the Ayurvedic practice was different, and we can't say that we will continue with the same model of practice now, impractical in the present day situation, because at the same time, Charaka has said, Dvesha Kala Pramanajnaha, you have to have a assessment of the Desha and the Kala. And when I say Kala Pramana, or assessment of the Kala, along with all the conventional assessment, okay, description of the Kala, of course all of them are true, I would add this also. The 21st century, and where the lifestyle is different, people's perception is different, and every patient is a Google master. And a Google master in the sense, before the patient comes to you, he would have a lot of information, wrong or right, that's another issue. He will have lots of information about the disease and the medicines, and it will be more difficult to tackle that kind of a Google background than really knowing the theory of the subject and being an expert in the field. So that's what I say, Desha Kala Pramanajna. So we need to have some competence in that area also. We cannot just shirk off that responsibility. We cannot deny that fact also. So when Charaka says Desha Kala Pramanajna, that Kala Jnana, we have to be contemporary. And being contemporary also considers certain of the issues of selecting these medicines. Next part. Now, the same, of course, is mentioned in the other samhitas also. Charaka again says that yoga of a aushadhi would be prepared only based upon the patient's condition. But the situation now is we have the yoga and then we have to select the patient which is suitable for the patient. And it's about ultimately the final success of the treatment is not the selection of the drug rather, it's about the exact combination of the yoga and combination of the patient. So, matra kalashraya yuktihi siddhihi yuktau pratisthita. That yukti is the most important issue. And tishtati pariyuktinya, a person who has that skill of yukti, selecting the right choice at the right time, he will be better than druvya jnanavatam sada. So simple knowledge of the medicine is not the primary. Primary is about planning the combination of the treatment where you understand the patient as well as understand the medicine properly. That's exactly what Ayurvedic theme would be, and with that theme we can continue the practice. Now I started my practice exactly with these themes, and my priority when I started my practice in 1983, because I had lots of issues, my personal issues. Like issues is because I have joined as a Shalya Tantra professor, I had to establish a unit of Shalya, and as a student, undergraduate student, I have written the records, Shalya records overnight, 25 case sheets. Amitabh Bachchan was one of my patients in my case sheets. And because the whole thing was imaginary, all the 25 cases we had tried imaginary, then why should you think of some other low class patients? Let us write the high class patients. That's how we have written the case sheet. And then when I entered the post-graduation course and when I entered the teaching service, I had a plan like to continue with the service, teaching service only for 5 years. Then I thought of, actually my plan was to continue only for 5 years in teaching and then switch off to full-time practice so that I can mint more money. But now the situation has changed, that's another issue. And that 5 years target was to create a situation where every student would have an opportunity to write the case sheets of those patients whom I have seen. This I could achieve in 5 years, but somehow I couldn't leave the teaching job because teaching bug has hurt me at that moment. Teaching bug, I use that word, and it forms an addiction. That teaching is an addiction issue, and that continued up to this day, and that's how the whole journey has started. So in the beginning, that being academic is one of the issues. When you go into practice, many of the people say that whatever you have studied in the college or the academics is not important, practice is totally different from the academics. But I say academics has exactly 1/3 of the role of the practice. You have to maintain that academics. At the same time, you have to have a viable model. Viable model in the sense where the patient can afford and the doctors can afford, and financial issues. I will not go into that part. Then it should be effective. At the end, the patient should get a competitive results. Now here, when I say competitive, it's not competing with the contemporary system, but when a patient comes to you, he should feel that there is an equal advantage or something more than what he gets from the other system. Because we are coexisting, you have a competitor. Charaka or Sushruta didn't have a competitor. After Sushruta or Charaka, it was only Yama who was next left over. But it's not the situation now. You have many other options. Of course, when I say Yama, there is another common joke which I use. Like in hospital, my case sheets, my staff writes my name as Yam Sharma. And in some areas, that Yam is read as Yama. That last, in some languages also, that half letter is not there, so they read it as Yama. And of course, it is true, mortality figures of my patients is very high because the reason is majority of the patients who I get are terminal patients who are either rejected in some other hospitals or where there is no other choice elsewhere, and they come to our hospital either because they don't have money for paying, because all the money is already spent elsewhere, or there is no hope as such. Of course, not all, many, and hence the mortality figures are higher. So Yama holds good from that point of view also practically. The other point is Charaka or Sushruta didn't have a competitor at that time, but today you have plenty of competitors, and unless you show that you have a opportunity, you have created something advantage to the patient, you have given something advantage to the patient won't come to you. So these are the three basic questions which I had when I started my private practice. Hospital practice is another issue. Now in my private practice, next slide, I now use only 33 yogas. I have selected the 33 yogas, and those 33 yogas are selected based upon simple issues. One, the cost, then efficacy and availability. These are the three basic issues which I have selected. I think I will not read out all the names. I will try to highlight like why I have selected these yogas in the next part of the presentation. So 33 yogas plus a few of the rarely used combinations. The maximum number of medicines which I have are around 40 in my clinic. And my practice is I don't prescribe medicines to the patients. I dispense the medicines to the patient, and then so that I can know exactly whether the patient has continued the treatment or whether he is a dropout or not. This is how I have maintained my practice. When I say this, I don't mean to say that you have to follow the same issue, but I am just presenting a model which is viable, and every model, you may have your own model of practice, and that model you can take certain of the issues which you find useful about your situation. Like, then that's about the next part. Next slide. Now, how this can be done? That's the other part. Now, I will try to give, again, I will not be able to go out into all the details and every disease asset. I will give one example of Roga Pariksha, how I do it. Now, take the example of the common cold fever, like patients which I usually say CPM, PCM practice, which is done by the usual practitioners, where the patients come for that common cold and so on. Generally, many areas, there is a feeling that the patients do not come to an Ayurvedic doctor for these day-to-day problems. For day-to-day problems, you have to use CPM, PCM. Ayurvedic practice is reserved for only chronic diseases. This is a general notion, but which is not really true. Among my patients whom I treat, of course, number is quite huge, and majority of the patients, a good number of patients, they come for these common cold or common day-to-day issues like fever, cold, and so on. And selecting an Ayurvedic treatment based upon the basic clinical assessment. After all, primarily the issue is the selection of the treatment. So I will try to comprehensively present the cases of Jwara, which could be categorized as variations of the Jwara, because conventionally in all our Chikitsa chapters, Jwara is the first Vyadhi, and I will not go beyond that. It will not be possible to go beyond that. Now, first slide. Another basic issue when I deal with the practice is I leave out no chance for any of the investigations left out, because we have to make an accurate diagnosis. Contemporary diagnosis definitely would be needed to predict the prognosis as such. Course of the disease can be better predicted with the available technologies of diagnosis. I have no hesitation to say that. And with that, you are safe, and you will be conveying a feeling of safety to the patient also, and that's one of the important issue. Whenever a patient comes to me, usually some of the patients, they come with a large file asset with all the previous records. I don't depend upon those records. I do a thorough clinical examination myself. Only after having my diagnosis, I will go through the previous records or go for the investigations. Investigations are not done for the sake of investigations. They are done only after having a basic clinical diagnosis. Of course, when we were studying in 80s, we had a system of medical audit, and that medical audit would be the number of investigations recommended by a doctor and how many of those results are negative or positive. If the results which were negative are more than 50%, then that doctor would be warned, like you are suggesting unnecessary investigations. But the situation now has changed in the contemporary throughout, everywhere, the practice. Medical practice, investigations are done for the sake of investigations. 90% of the investigations are negative, only 10% fortunately may become positive, and the patients also would be impressed by that series of investigations. When a patient with a common cold asks, should I have a MRI scan or so on? So that's the situation which we are living with, and you have a problem about that. But my idea is not to be carried away by that issue. We have to depend upon the basic clinical examination of the patient first. And I always teach to my students is, if you have not made a probable diagnosis, never investigate the patient. If you are not able to make a probable diagnosis, send the patient to somebody else who can make it. If you have made a probable diagnosis, either you confirm it or maybe rule out that with the investigations. Investigations are necessary, and that's exactly the theme which you have to maintain as such. Maybe it looks a bit odd in the contemporary situation of practice where the people are sent for investigations and the doctors look at only the investigation reports, and most of the times even you will have a telemedicine. You do not see the patient, and then that telemedicine itself, word itself, concept itself is not a medical idea or Ayurvedic idea rather. From Ayurvedic practice point of view, a personal relationship between you and the patient is one of the important issues, much more than any other aspects. With the telemedicine, it may not be. So anyway, that's about one of the issues. The other part is about we make a modern diagnosis, and my prescription would be based upon the dosha assessment in the disease as such. Now all that what I do is I will try to give a model of how I do in my practice in the common day-to-day issue of the common cold as such. Next. Now the common cold varieties of the patients whom you see, commonest variety could be like a simple cold and fever, which either could be considered as a pratishthana or kaphaja jvara. Typical clinical features are anashate yasya vidupyateja prakridhyate shishyati nasaya. Now in these conditions, most of the times you don't need any medicines. Of course, when Charaka says like jvara chikitsa, there is no need of medicine, it should be only the langhana and no kashaya rasadravyas. It may become impractical in the present day situation when you advise to the patient. It could be true for yourselves, of course, true for yourselves. We may not take the medicines, take rest, take light food, that's enough. But for the patient, you need to give some medicines, otherwise patient will not pay you also. So that's also the other issue. And it's not possible. It becomes impractical if you say that you don't take the medicines to the patients who come to you. And my prescription at that level is Mrityunjaya, Arogyavardhini and Amritarishta, considering this as either Vata Kaphaja or Kaphaja Jvara as such, and it's more effective than paracetamol. Interesting, these are certain of the issues which many of the practitioners may not accept in the beginning, but once you have tried it, you'll know that. Patients will recognize the advantages of the treatment. The advantages are, when you give this Mrityunjaya, Arogyavardhini, Amritarishta, patient may not have the normal temperature immediately, unlike that of the paracetamol, where the temperature may get reduced immediately. Patient may continue to have the fever, but his appetite doesn't reduce. He will not have a normal appetite. He will be able to do all his normal activities. The advantage is seen in the next consequence. In the next run, when the patient would have another episode of the common cold, he would not need that medicine for even 2 days. 1 dose would be enough. And the incidence, that gap between the 2 episodes will be gradually reduced if the patient doesn't take that disease suppressing medicines like paracetamol or so on. Now this advantage is noted by my patients, and there are many of my patients who take the medicines for 2 days and keep it for 2 months, and then at the end of 2 months they come, I had many 2 or 3 episodes, and then that medicine stock is exhausted, and they identify the advantage. Now once you have created such community of patients who identify the advantages of this Ayurvedic treatment, then your practice will always flourish. It's not surprising to have that huge number of patients. Number of patients will a spontaneous issue. Only thing is we need to have that confidence, and we need to convey the patient the advantages of this treatment. This advantage can be conveyed only when the patient has experienced it, or rather only when the doctor has experienced it. If the doctor himself is having a doubt, and I always say this, to be Ayurvedic practitioner, you should be Ayurvedic patient first. If you have become an Ayurvedic patient, you have appreciated the value of Ayurvedic medicines on your own, then only you will be able to do that. That's exactly what I do. When I use only Ayurvedic medicines, only when, if I imaginarily, I or my close members of the family would be treated with the same medicines, then only I will treat the patient with the same medicines. If I have a choice otherwise, then I would suggest the patient also that it is the same choice which is to be. It cannot be the other way, like a separate treatment for a doctor. So a doctor who takes paracetamol or antibiotic for himself definitely cannot reach to the patient. This is 100% true, though scientifically researchers may not convey this, but something of a 6th level of communication between you and the patient does exist. And this I say after 40 years of clinical practice, I am convinced about that existence of that 6th level of communication between the patient and doctor. And that's why I always say, like, the value of a interpersonal relationship between the patient and the doctor is more crucial than any of the medicines or other way. Anyway, that's about one part. Next, of course, the same Kaphaja Jvara, the description of the Kaphaja Jvara as mentioned in the Samhitas, Pratishthana, it's exactly the same. So either it's Vata Kaphaja or Kaphaja Jvara in the initial stages, that's the common cold condition. Next level. Now a common cold with a bit variations, the variations which you can see in the common cold, and how I assess the dosha lakshanas. the common cold which is persisting for a bit longer duration or has some allergic component, where there is a rhinitis with the postnasal drip. In that condition again, it's a pratishaya upadrava, where you will have the kshavathu as maybe one of the named diseases in the Samhitas, shirogruttam, shado pravartanam, tata angamardaha, karisasromata. These are the upadrava, and when you have this, it's a evidence of a involvement of pitta kapha. Dosha dushya lakshanas would change. And in that condition, again, the treatment will be the same, medicine will be the same, but the duration of the treatment will be for 4 days. Instead of 2 days, I prescribe the medicine for 4 days. Patient has to continue the same for 4 days. Next part. Next slide. Now, the same, the kshavathu, there will be another variation where it will be having more of involvement of kapha as such, and the discharges become thicker. This now important is contemporary system doesn't mention about these stages. It's only Ayurvedic literature which mentions about these stages of the conditions. So the question is, who is more elaborate? Ayurvedic literature is definitely more elaborate. Only thing is, we need to correlate it to the patient. Now, in that condition, granashite marmani yasya duste anilaha nasikayam nirati kafaniyataha bhusha sashabdaha tam rogamahu kshavutum vidijnaha. Now, and along with that, when it has a anadda pihita yasya tanusrava pravartini, when it is a tanusrava, the discharges become watery and it become chronic. At the same time, there will be galatalu ostashoshaha, the feeling of dryness in the internal throat area. That's exactly what we call as the postnasal drip as such, which is again a variety of the kshavathu, where it is a Vata kapha which is the predominant dosha. In that condition, I would be preferring either Tribhuna Kirti or Laghusut Shekara instead of Aragyavardhini, because it is a predominant kapha involvement conditions, and the treatment will be, duration of the treatment will be for 2 weeks, because naturally that's the issue. Now, when we say that the duration of the treatment is for 2 weeks and advice to the patient will readily accept that, because at this stage, your paracetamol really doesn't work. And first stage, of course, paracetamol gives a very instantaneous results. Within half an hour, the fever may subside. But once it comes to that stage of postnasal drip, paracetamol doesn't work, and most of the patients, or many of the patients, may seek for an Ayurvedic treatment, and majority of the patients who come to me for the first time, they would be of this category, because they have already tried paracetamol and then they have the issues, and then you treat them. Right, next part. Now, when the same becomes chronic, now it becomes chronic because many reasons. Again, I will not blame only the other medicines. Due to many reasons, it may become chronic, including one of the factors is because you take repeated suppressive medicines like so on, paracetamol and so on. It becomes a condition which would be named by Charaka as again another of the very complicated condition, where you will have a Pitta Vata or Tridosha Lakshanas, where you will have Ushnaha Sapitaga Stravo Granat Sravati Paitike Krishaha Atipanduhu Santaptaha. Patient would have a systemic involvement where either there could be an impairment of the day-to-day functions, and Agni, the appetite, will be severely reduced as such, and lots of burning sensation, which is suggestive of either a chronic sinusitis or a rhinitis, chronic rhinitis conditions as such, which I consider as involvement of Pitta Vata or Tridosha involvement, and that my treatment will change from Aragyavardhini to Suta Shekara, Pipalyasa or Somasa as such. Nasya would be useful at that period. Nasya used in the initial Nasya, particularly with the Tailas. Now, I am not suggesting about the other Nasyas. Taila, Anutaila or other Tailas used as a Nasya in the early stage may not give the results, but when it becomes chronic, it's exactly the Nasya which will produce the results as such. Next part. Now, the same becomes chronic, very chronic, where the discharges become thicker. Now, this kind of category doesn't exist in the contemporary system. It's only in the Ayurvedic medicine that you have this kind of categorization, which is named as a Bhramshatu, and Bhramshatu is a Prabhrashate Nasikayavayascha Sandraha Vidagdaha Lavanaha Kafastu. The discharges become saltish in odor and they become thick, and it's not possible to swipe it out. And Sushruta has given a simile to that. of the brain, Singhanaka Pratimha. Singhanaka is the word used by Sushruta, and he has compared to that of the brain contents in the other part. Like anyway, it's again a part of joke. But Praksantita Murdani Pitatat Bhukta Brahmshatu Vyadhim Ushanti. In such conditions where the Brahmshatu is the Vyadhi mentioned, the treatment has to be prolonged for 8 weeks, and it's obviously again involvement of the Tridosha, same treatment, same medicines, but the duration of the treatment has to be for about 8 weeks. Then again you can show the results as such. This is how the dosha assessment can modify the selection of the drugs and the treatment. Next slide. Now, the another variation of these would be the allergic rhinitis. Allergic rhinitis conditions where bhuta pratishaha akasmat vinivartate. Recurrent episodes of the discharges where the patient becomes sensitive to the external environment, and either it may have the stage where there could be discharges could be thick, or the discharges may continue to be remain sampakvaha apakvava. Sampakva when it becomes thicker, apakva when it is not so thicker. Such of those conditions are when it could be kafakrute kafaha granat shuklaha shitaha sabet muhu. The shukla discharge, whitish discharge from the nose, also is the typical issue, or ajasram acham salila prakasham yasya avivanam srupatiha nasa. There is a continuous watery discharge. Any of these which is persisting for a long duration and has a tendency to have aggravation at seasonally or when the environment is colder, like ratrau visheshana hitam vikaram nasa parisravam iti. Nasa parisrava or the allergic rhinitis are the conditions which are suggestive of the same pathology. Now, next, in that condition, what you see is there is a tendency for the mucosa to be atrophied. If you use a nasoscope, you will be able to see there is a tendency for the atrophy to occur, and there is a edema in the mucosal membrane. Now, in that condition, in that condition, the treatment would be Mrutyunjaya, Lagusutashekara, Amritarista, and Anutelanasya. Duration would be for about 3 months. Of course, there could be another option of the treatment. I usually prefer that option of the treatment when the condition persists for a long duration. That's about either the Virechana or the Vamana. Once the acute attacks subside, the discharges reduce. To prevent that further episodes of the discharge, I may suggest Haridra Khanda or Chavanaprasha. In a very advanced stages, if these discharges persist for very long duration, years together, then in that condition, Makaradwaja is added to Lagusutta Mishrana or Thalisari Churna, and it is given, and that gives you the results as such. That's how Vita has to be assessed. Again, Makaradwaja with the idea of tendency for Dhatukshaya or Tridosha involvement. Next. Now, there is another condition which is mentioned by Charaka, but it's not really mentioned in contemporary system, but you will come across such patients. Patients who will have a hemorrhagic discharge. That hemorrhagic rhinitis, I have put a question mark, because no texts of modern medicine would have that word. I have created that word. I take the privilege of creating that word also. Maybe because you have such patients, you come across such patients, but they are not really mentioned in the clinical in the textbooks, but they are simply considered as a variation of the edema, complication of the edema of the mucous membrane, and there it is the Rakta Pratishaya where Raktasravaha Pravartate, and it can later result in the next complication of Uroghataha. There can be a lower respiratory tract infections involved, which could be the extension of the same, and it's a very typical of a chronic complication. And in that condition, usually in the contemporary system, the suggested treatment is surgery. You need to have the sinus drainage or curating of the membrane. But we can manage without that. Surgery can be avoided, curating can be avoided if you follow the treatment of involvement of the Pitta, typically Pitta Rakta Jadushti, and the opted treatment is Kamaduga Rasa plain. And when I say Kamaduga plain, I do not use that Muktayukta Kamaduga. Muktayukta Kamaduga is, compared to the cost, the advantages would be lesser. Kamaduga plain cost is around 60 paise for one tablet, whereas Kamaduga plain, the Kamaduga with the Mukta, it's around 60 rupees almost, and that kind of a difference in the advantage. I may conduce from that point of view. Conduce in the sense that cost and value, these are the two aspects. So we need to consider that also. When I say this, I am not saying that Kamaduga with Mukta is useless. That's not the issue. The issue is compared to the cost, whether that value is so much magnified or not. I strongly say that it's not. It's not proportionate to that extent. And this would be the treatment, and it's a sure shot remedy. In hemorrhagic rhinitis conditions, Sutashekara Kamaduga given is a sure shot remedy where you can definitely avoid the surgeries if you follow the same regimes as such. Next part. Now, another of the complication, delayed complication would be atrophic rhinitis. Same, continuing for long duration, patients neglecting the conditions or having, and again, huge number of patients, they end up in Ayurvedic hospitals where there will be atrophic rhinitis. The severe atrophy would occur. Once the atrophic changes have occurred and the mucous membrane has become blanched out, the prognosis is poor. No treatment can make that person 100% recovery. Neither, there is absolutely no treatment, even the contemporary system, surgical treatment, absolutely no question, no other medical treatment which can make the patient very comfortable, only symptomatic treatment, suppressive treatment. And with our treatment also, I don't say that the patient can recover completely. Prognosis is poor, but we can give a equal competent results, like patient can have a satisfactory result when he uses Mrityunjaya Sutashekara and a Anulomana Dravya like Avipattikara, which I prefer. So Anulomana Chikitsa is to be used, or a Virechana Chikitsa as such. Virechana Chikitsa in the sense, all that Snehana procedures, protocol of the Snehana and the Svedana, then the Virechana, that's exactly which has to be done. And that's exactly the Nasa Anaha, which is mentioned by Charaka, which is a complication of the delayed issues of the Pratishthana. Next one. Now the next would be, if the same, another variation of the same chronic complications in the same common cold issue would be a nasal polyp formation. Very chronic conditions, it can result in a hypertrophy of the mucosa, accumulation of fluid in the mucosal area, and there again, the option of the treatment available now is surgery, where the nose becomes blocked and surgery is the option. Of course, surgery gives an excellent results for the initial 3 or 4 months. Recurrence rate is almost 70%. Only 30% of the patients may have a complete resolution. Recurrence rate is very high, and repeated surgeries often end up in atrophic changes. This also is a common phenomenon. And that's exactly mentioned by Sushruta as the nasarcious or nasa polyps as such. In that condition, the treatment would be, I would prefer Triphala Gugulu, Granthi Chikitsa, considered as a variation of the Granthi, and then Mrityunjaya, of course, Amritarishta for the basic Jwara conditions. And most of the times, the results are palliative. It may not be absolutely satisfactory in every patient, but acute conditions can be definitely suppressed and clinical results can be satisfactory. I consider this as Yapya as such. Surgical treatment also is not necessary. But one thing is very important, if a patient comes with a polyp in the age of 40 or above, the malignancy has to be ruled out. Biopsy is necessary. I would not manage that patient only with the medical treatment till I have a confirmation of the tumor pathologist, because nasal tumors would present exactly with the same clinical presentation and it's always misleading. So a polyp, nasal polyp occurring in the later half of the life, above 40, it's absolutely necessary to have the biopsy. I will never have a compromise on that issue. Only after having the biopsy, if it is confirmed that it is non-malignant, then I will manage the treatment condition as such. And that's one of the important issue which makes that difference in approach to the clinical conditions as such. And of course, the same is described as nasa pratinaha by Sushruta, kafavrtaha vayu udana samnyaha, yada samargam viganastita syat, granam runoti vasata sarogaha. There is always a condition of the grana avarana, a perfect description, beautiful description of the clinical presentation by Sushruta, and that's considered as a nasa pratinaha, and it's also considered as yapya by Sushruta. That's also the important issue. Next part. Now, the other variations of Jwara, now because we have referred to the Jwara issue, Vata Raktaja Jwara or tendency to involve the lower respiratory tract, which also would be another usual complications which you see. When you auscultate, you may have occasional fine crepitations heard over there, and the patient would have more of the systemic signs as such. In that condition, along with the Pratishthana, Kasaha Sweda Pravartana. That Kasa and the Sweda Pravartana would be the other variable clinical sign. Santapaha Madhyavegascha, not a very high fever. That's typically what you see in case of the acute bronchitis conditions. The treatment will be I will be adding Talisadi Churna, which is Kapagna, and Pipalyasava or Kumaryasava, depending upon the appetite of the patient. When patient has a poor appetite and he needs support for Agni, it will be the Kumaryasava. If it is a Kapha Pradhana Lakshanas, then Pipalyasava is the choice. With that, the treatment will be again quite effective treatment. You don't need an antibiotic at that level. But one of the issues is, at that time, I would be having the total leukocyte count of the patient. If the total leukocyte count of the patient is more than 18,000, definitely it may not be possible to manage with our drugs. It's a limitation, asadhya lakshana for Ayurvedic treatment, which is not mentioned in Samhitas. Charaka or Sushruta have not mentioned about the total leukocyte count as asadhya lakshanas. Asadhya lakshana of the Vyadhi are mentioned in different manner. But what I have experienced in my clinical practice is 18,000 total count is a limitation. If it is go beyond that, patient has to be managed with an antibiotic, which is a choice. Again, choice is left to you, whether you prescribe the antibiotic or you refer a patient for antibiotic to be prescribed by some other doctors is the issue. But that's a limitation for Ayurvedic treatment in that condition. Right, next one. Next. Now, another of the complication, very chronic of this condition is septic changes, septic complications which occur. Very chronic sinusitis which results in a septic complication where there will be continuous purulent discharge. Nasa Paka, which also is described by Sushruta. Grahanashritam pittam arunshi kuryad yasmin vikare balavanscha pakaha. That paka is balavan. Such is considered as Nasa Paka, and that's considered as a asadhya vyadhi by Sushruta. Next part. In that condition, initially a course of antibiotic is necessary, and that when you have a purulent discharge from the nose, a Nasa Paka, managing with only Ayurvedic treatment, I find it not possible at that level. You need to have a course of antibiotic. Surgical exploration also may be needed. I have no hesitation to drain that sinus at that moment when there is a huge accumulation of the pus. But the important is you can prevent further recurrences with the same treatment which we use for the other acute sinusitis conditions as such. Now, the condition is considered as either Putinasa or Nasapaka by Charaka, and in both the conditions they are considered as Asadhya or Yapya, and they are really Asadhya or Yapya. So, from our contemporary point of view, I would not have a hesitation to suggest the patient for either an antibiotic treatment or a surgical indication, depending upon the investigations reports as such. Next part. Now, the other variations of the Jwara, which I consider would be the Pittaja Jwara, where the patient would have usually these infective conditions like hepatitis, infective hepatitis like conditions. In that condition, it's usually you will have the Pita Vinmutra Netratvam, Paitike Brahmayavacha, that Pita Vinmutra Netratva, hepatic pathology. And that's one of the strong areas of Ayurvedic treatment. Many of the patients who come to Ayurvedic treatment would be of that category. Once the bilirubin level is raised, usually there is a general notion in the people, among the people, like for liver diseases, Ayurvedic treatment is good. But very interestingly, Ayurvedic literature, Samhitas, describe about the Yakrit or the liver in only a few sentences. Rarely you have 2 or 3 sentences about Yakrit and the phenomena of the Yakrit. But the notion among the society is liver disorders, Ayurveda is the treatment. Every pharmacy, Ayurvedic pharmacy would have a treatment for liver disorder. These are all the ambiguous issues. We will not go into the detail of that, but interesting issues also. Anyway, I will not go into the other part of that, discussion of the other part of it. But that's one of the area where we can definitely have an advantage, and that advantage, particularly viral hepatitis condition. So only thing is you have to confirm about the viral hepatitis. The other variables like acute yellow atrophy, of course, it's a incurable condition and virtually nobody can manage that patient. When many of those currently new generation these viral infections like which are like dengue and so on, you need to be very cautious about the daily progress of the condition. But otherwise, a simple viral hepatitis A or B, we can manage the patient effectively with the Mrityunjaya Arogya Kumaryasava, along with all the protocols of the liver protective regime. That's important. Rest and the diet, that protective regimes, they have to be followed. That's not a part of any system as such, but it's a management of the patient. That's essential. With that, definitely we can manage the patients effectively. Right, next. Now, the Vata Jwara, it's a very typical of the common now. Again, these days you have this kind of chikungunya and so on, viral reactive fever conditions where there will be lots of pain in the joints and swelling in the joints as a coexisting symptom of the conditions. So many times people say like chikungunya, whether it is described in Ayurveda or not, it's exactly the same which is described in Ayurveda, where the pain in the joints and vepathu vishamo vegaha kantostha parishoshanam and shiro hrugata rug vaktra vairasyam. These are the exact clinical features of so-called all that. Again, I will not say only chikungunya. All that variables of these reactive arthritis conditions. You may have plenty of new names. No need to worry about that. Whether Ayurveda has mentioned about chikungunya or not. Chikungunya definitely is not mentioned by Ayurveda. Name is not mentioned. But the disease phenomena we can effectively manage with the line of treatment of the Vishamadvara, because it is a Vishamaramba Vishamadvara. Lakshmi Narayan Rasa Arogyavardhini is my choice of the conditions. Of course, investigations are absolutely necessary. Without the investigations, you cannot really handle such patients. To rule out malaria, rule out chikungunya, all the relevant investigations have to be done. I have no hesitation to say that I will do all the investigations, make the exact diagnosis and follow the treatment as such. Next part. Then other variations which we will have come across where the patient come with a symptom of Jvara would be the gastritis or food poisoning conditions, where it's Sushruta has identified this as a Vata Pitta Jvara Kriti, Vata Pitta Jvara conditions, where exactly the same the patient would have Vomathu, Romaharshaha, Aruchihi, evidence of the gastrointestinal tract abnormalities, and in that condition my prescription would be Mrityunjaya, Ananda Bhairavi, Musakarista would be my prescription as such. Next part. Now, other exanthematous fever conditions, which also are, though not very common now, still they do occur. Chickenpox, though it's rare, it occurs. Measles, they tend to occur quite frequently. Of course, smallpox is claimed to be eradicated, and in these conditions, it is the typical of the Raktaja Jvara, Raktaprapta Jvara, and in that condition, it's having the pitikaha, the eruptions over the surface of the body, would be the typical clinical presentation, and there the Paripathadikada is the better choice of the treatment than Amrita. Reasons, of course, we will try to highlight in the next part of the presentation. I will try to highlight about how this selection is done. Next part. Now, whenever we speak of Ayurvedic treatment, my guideline is whenever you treat any disease with the Ayurvedic treatment, the asadhya lakshanas mentioned in the text are the limitations for your treatment. Once you have the asadhya lakshana, I say this is not possible to be managed with the Ayurvedic treatment. Either then the patient has to go for other alternative treatment, or it remains asadhya everywhere. That depends upon the other issues. So you have to be more careful about the asadhya lakshana in the clinical assessment. Most of the times the students study in the course for the sake of examination the usual lakshanas and so on. Asadhya lakshanas are really not given sufficient attention. And in the text also, asadhya lakshanas are mentioned every context, but they are not mentioned in a very prominent manner. So you have to search for the asadhya lakshanas, and you have to be aware of the asadhya lakshana of each of the vyadhi. So those who are aware of the asadhya lakshanas of vyadhi can have a safe Ayurvedic practice. That's the final version. So in each of the vyadhi, you have to be bothered about the asadhya lakshanas, and I have just quoted some of the examples of the asadhya lakshanas, like a patient having the toxemia. Toxemia now can be defined with the total leukocyte count, as I said, like 18,000 leukocyte count, but Charaka had described that total, these asadhya lakshanas with all the other clinical signs like pralapaha, srotasampakaha. That srotasampakaha is exactly the septicemia, where you will have that paka in the circulation. Kujanam chetanachyutihi, impaired consciousness being the sign of the toxemia, they are already mentioned as such. Natishtha shitaha alpasamnyaha, the exact features of the toxemia where you may not have a raised temperature, but the core temperature of the body could be increased, and that's also mentioned as antarvegi jvara. And in that condition, it's also named as abhinyasa by Sushruta. Now, that abhinyasa jvara also is considered as asadhya. These are definitely asadhya to be managed with the Ayurvedic medicines. Whether you can manage with the other system or not is the other issue. Many of the conditions are treatable, many conditions are not treatable. Choice is left to you whether you use a contemporary system yourselves or refer to the patient to the other hospital is depending upon your skill and ability. Next part. Now similarly, another of the important toxic signs or asadhya lakshanas among the Jwara Prakarana, Jwara Vyadhis would be the meningeal signs where you will have all the lakshanas of Vojo Visramsana where the patient would have Abhi Jagrat Swapan Jantuhu Tandra Alushya Pralapavanna. Patient would not be totally unconscious, but patient would not be able to have a normal orientation around the area, and Srastangaha, neck rigidity as the sign, and this neck rigidity is the translation which is used now. Sushruta has used the word Srastangata as a sign of Asadhya Lakshana, and that also is Asadhya Lakshanas. So with this, of course, next slide. So the important is another of the variation is Pralepaka Jwara, where it will be where the patient would have a chronic emaciating disorder, and hence because of the emaciation it becomes asadhya. So all that would be, you have to identify the asadhya lakshanas, and maybe a few of the asadhya lakshanas which I would add would be a WBC count less than 3000 or above 18,000, a platelet count less than 60,000, or a Vidal positive in a dilution of more than 160, I consider this as asadhya from Ayurvedic point of view. Other diseases within this category, we can definitely safely manage with the Ayurvedic treatment. Now, this is about a bit summary of the Jwara Lakshanas. Next slide. Now, I will not elaborate more on that. I think if I go on elaborating that, we will not be able to have the total view of this. And I am sure, like whatever I have discussed is not complete. It's only a comprehensive, just a few of the important points which we consider in the practice. And in the practice, you will have innumerable variety of these variations, and there you need to adjust to the situations. Now, that's one aspect of the practice, Roga Pariksha. The next comes the Aushadha Pariksha. Now, among the Aushadha Pariksha, because I have told about my choices of the drugs limited to 40 or plus, how I manage, how I select these drugs as such. This is how I would like to suggest about. Again, a brief of that. Next. Now, among the drugs which I use, one is the Agnitundi. Now, I think I will not go into details. Next slide. In the Agnitundi, now, for each of the drug, the issues are, there are certain basic primary issues. Whether Rasaushadhis should be used as a Vyadhi Pratinika Chikitsa or Dosha Pratinika Chikitsa. Controversy. People would have a debate on that point. I would say that Dosha Pratinikata of each of the drug is a important issue, and because of that, you can use the same drug in a wide variable conditions. If you have to manage a large number of diseases with a lesser number of drugs, that Dosha Pratinikata of each of the drug has to be assessed thoroughly. Depending upon that Vyadhi Pratinikata and considering these Rasaushadhis are disease specific, would limit your scope as such, and you will be having again facing the problem of plenty. When I say the problem of plenty, if you are using too many drugs, too many medicines in your practice, thousands of yogas, you will never have a authoritative knowledge of each of the yoga. Textual knowledge is one part. When you use the same medicine in a large number of patients, you will have some extra textual information which will be gained by you, either the limitations or it could be the advantages of that drug. It's something like the usual proverb, Panchatantra story, where if instead of digging small pits every day, if you dig in the same area every day, you will definitely get water. But if you do the same effort by digging hundreds of pits, you will not get the water. The same is true. If you use the same drug in a large number of patients, you will get some extra information. But if your use is limited to lesser number of patients, but you will be using larger number of drugs, your perception about that would be limited. In your limited lifetime, you will not have the opportunity to use all the 64,000 yogas. So there is a need to limit your scope to a limited numbers. I am not saying only 33 is the final. You may have more or lesser, but you have to limit, like these are the number of drugs, varieties of the drugs which we will be using. And then you know about the drugs with that in-depth knowledge. Then only you will be able to make out that. Now, that's how I manage. I consider each of these drugs in terms of their doshagnata based upon the contents. And again, I will not go into the issue of details of the contents. The summary of what I consider Agnitundivati, a popular drug. I consider this as a Kapabhata dosha as such, and the dhatus would be Rasarakta, and where there is a Deepana needed as such. the mala involved is wit, and it's primarily Annavaha dosha, where you have the Kaphavrata Lakshanas. Kaphavrata Lakshanas need not be only about the gastrointestinal tract abnormality, it could be anywhere, like Shaitya Gaurava Shulani or Katvaji Upashayaha. These are the features which you see, or Langana Ayasa Ruksha Ushnakamata, a pain aggravated by movements or exercise, which we call as a colicky pain. Agnitundi can be definitely used. Now, clinical conditions, when I said that this is not a complete list, these are definitely not the complete list as such. I am just giving you some of the common disease conditions where I use these drugs, like variable drugs like chronic gastritis or acute gastritis both, hepatitis-like conditions where the Agnimandi is the clinical signs, pancreatitis, chronic pancreatitis, where modern contemporary treatment has very serious limitations, is one of the area where we can have a very significant advantage over the treatment, and Agnimandi is one of the drugs over there, or a renal calculus with hydronephrosis. Agnitundi can be a choice of the medicine where the edema and the pain can be reduced. Of course, if there is a massive hydronephrosis, surgical treatment would be necessary, absolutely. So in each of these conditions, you will have to have a cut-off line where the Ayurvedic treatment has a limitation. With that, we can manage that. So next, another of the drug is Ananda Bhairavi, next part. Now, in the Ananda Bhairavi, I would be considering this as a Kaphavatagna, and the dhatus as Rasa or Agni and Amapachana, and particularly Annavaha Srota Dushti, conditions like colitis of all forms, malabsorption pathologies, chronic appendicitis. This is very interesting with the appendicitis. I think we were talking about the issue with Dr. Vaidya Vedas in the morning. Appendicitis patients, now the question was about whether Ayurvedic surgeon, what he can do and so on. As an Ayurvedic surgeon, what I would say is, my data is, I have more patients of appendicitis seen in the OPD, but lesser number of patients taken to the OT. So OPD to OT ratio of appendicitis of my patients and compared to any other surgeons, there is a huge difference. A good number of appendicitis patients with all the same clinical assessment conditions can be managed with only the medical treatment. Surgery can be avoided. And avoiding that surgery, I consider as the identity of Ayurvedic surgery. So, otherwise, the question was whether the technique is the same or not. Of course, the technique of appendicectomy which I do and any other surgeon would do would be the same. I will follow the same method of surgery, but my identity as an Ayurvedic surgeon would be the surgery that Shalya Chikitsa is considered as the Jaganyatamaha, and where Snehadi Kriya Sadhyeshu Shalyatantram Pratishitham. This is what Sushruta has said. The Shalya Chikitsa is a Pratishidha, it's a prohibited. If you have any other option, only when you have consider all the other options, surgery would be the last choice. Whereas in the contemporary system, the surgery has been considered as many times first choice of the surgery, and then you have another a confusing issue or maybe a controversial issue of preventive surgery. This is another issue. Again, whether it's relevant or not, but I think I should refer to that issue also. These days, this preventive surgery has become more popular, and people say that after surgery we have prevented. Like, example, in USA, about 40% of the females at the age of 40, hysterectomy would be done to prevent the possibility of uterine cancer. If you go into the history, in 1870, during the 72nd World War, in Britain, there was a rule, like every person who would join the army would have to undergo appendicectomy. This was based upon the statistics, like the absentees in the army were because of the appendicitis. So you can prevent appendicitis if you have removed the appendix. That's the idea. And this continued for about 5 to 6 years. Later it was found that appendicectomy has not really helped. Rather, the absenteeism due to other diseases had increased, and then that practice was stopped. Now, of course, you have lots of ideas of prophylactic surgery. Hysterectomy is one, mastectomy is one. Then I would say, because you have a problem of headache, possibility of headache, why not headectomy? If you have a risk of cardiac pathology, why not a cardiectomy? And so on. So that's the other part. That's all the point. It's a different issue. But I think I could highlight on that part also. Preventive surgery is not the bread of Ayurvedic surgery. Ayurvedic surgery is where the surgery is done as a last resort, when all the other system has failed. That's the identity of Ayurvedic surgeon. Probably that was one of the possible questions amongst you, like when I was introduced as a Ayurvedic surgeon. Naturally, what's that speciality about him? That speciality is the same, like we follow and we reduce the number of surgery, and by reducing the number of surgery, I claim myself as a efficient surgeon. Controversy, unacceptable. But I think with all the confidence I say that that's my identity. Now anyway, about this chronic appendicitis, of course, that's one of the area where we can definitely have that management. Next part, Arogyavardhini is another issue. Next, go to the next slide, second slide. Again, Arogyavardhini assessment, I think I will not go into the yoga combinations as such, because that will be making you bored as such. So the issue is previous Arogyavardhini, where it will be previously. That it's a Tridoshahara yoga, and particularly where there is a Dhatvagni Mandya, Arogyavardhini is indicated. I use Arogyavardhini in a large number of diseases. General notion like Arogyavardhini is meant for hepatic disorder, it's not true. Arogyavardhini I use in common cold, as we have already referred to, hepatitis, diabetes mellitus, hypothyroidism. These are the conditions where I consider the Dhatvagni Mandya. Dhatvagni Mandya mentioned by Ashtanga Sangraha is a very perfect description of the situations where it has to be treated, where the Pachakamshaha Dhatustaha Tesham Mandyat, or the Mandya of the Dhatvagni, is a very perfect description of all those conditions where the metabolic energy has been affected, and in that condition Arogyavardhini has indication. So it's not limited to only one system. Instead, you have a large number of indications for the same drug. Right. Next issue. Similarly, Chandraprabhavati, the next step. Again, Chandraprabha, I use it in large number of conditions like anemia, neuritis, myalgia, osteoarthritis. It's not limited only to the Mutravaha Srotas or the related to the Pradara or so on. That's what the general people. So urinary disorders, of course, are the indications as such. So this way, I think I will be trying to be brief with I have tried to accumulate the information about majority of the drugs I use. That's exactly the issue. Next is Ekanga Vira Rasa. Next slide about the Ekanga Vira Rasa. Again, the indications are quite huge, where there is a Kaphavrta Vata Lakshana. Irrespective of the system where used, often the people say that Ekanga Vira is only for paralysis conditions. It's not only about that. Ekanga Vira can be used in a significant number of abnormalities of the patients, where it could be anemia, neuritis, myalgia, and so on. These are the conditions where we can use Ekanga Vira along with the neurological pathologies. Next slide, please. Now, Gandhaka Rasayana is another of the conditions. Gandhaka Rasayana, of course, is a Rasayana, and it can be a Kushtagna and can be used in Ajirna, Raktadusti, and Vranaropana. Most of my postoperative patients, I use Triphala Gugul Gandhaka Rasayana without any analgesics. Antibiotics also are very few which I use in my postoperative patients. Virtually almost nil. Of course, in many patients I do use, I don't say that I never use that. The other indications for the Gandhaka Rasayana are any form of the wound, Branagna, infective lesions of skin like scabies and so on, pyoderma and so on, hemorrhoids, fistulae. These are the conditions where Gandhaka Rasayana can be effectively used. Right. Next. So Tribhuna Kirti Rasa, where it's a Kapha Jwara indications. Next slide. The same issue, Tribhuna Kirti Rasa, the indications are the same, where you have a Kapha Prakopa Lakshanas. It could be all sorts of the Kapha Jwara, which I just referred to earlier. So the point is, the selection of the drug would be, assessment of the drug would be based upon the Doshagnata, would be the issue. You have to depend upon the Doshagnata assessment based upon its contents, indications mentioned in the text, and at times it could be something based upon your clinical experience. When you use the same medicine on large number of patients, you may get some information which is beyond the text, which is not really mentioned in the text. So when I say like the Doshagnata, at times, not always, at times, it could be something beyond what the text would be say, based upon what we experience in the clinical practice. Next part. So similarly, the Mrityunjaya Rasa, next. In the Mrityunjaya Rasa, it's predominantly a Tridoshaja Vyadhi, and I would give this, my numbers. Like it's a predominantly Vataja involvement, Vata 2, Pitta 1, Kapha 2. This is number which I have given. that what I would say extra textual information, which is not really a part of the textual information, based upon the clinical experience and the indications, of course, a huge number of patients. And the maximum, if I assess the total number, variety, quantity of the medicines which I use in my practice, Mrityunjaya comes number 1, Chandraprabha comes number 2. These are the two most commonly used drugs in my practice among the patients whom I use as such. Right, next part. Similarly, the Shwasakuta Rasa, I think we will go a bit faster about this issue, otherwise it will be crossing the time limit also. The Shwasakuta Rasa, which I would be considering this as Kapha-Vata-hara, and mainly in acute and chronic bronchitis, in emphysema conditions, even in severe carpulmonal conditions also, it can be used with a effective limitations. Next part. Next asset, Sudhshekar Rasa. Again, it's a Pitta Kapahara Vyadhi, Rasa Rakta Dhatu, and conditions like gastritis, sinusitis, food poisoning, these are the conditions where we can use wherever there is a Pitta Vrta Vata Lakshanas or Amla Pitta Lakshanas. Next. Kanchanara Gugulu. Next. It's again Kapha Pradhana Vyadhi. In all the Kapha Pradhana Vyadhi, it can be used where, like, it could be Granthi, Galaganda or Arbuda. In these conditions, it can be used as it, and the effective treatment. Right, next part. Next, Kaishora Gugulu. Next, of course, is again one of the Rakta Prasadaka, where you have involvement of the Vata Pitta and the disease indications like rheumatoid arthritis, gouts, varicosities, peripheral ischemic disorders. These are the drugs of choice as such. Right, next part. Similarly, Triphala Gugulu as a Vrana is used for any Mamsa or Medo Dhatu Dushti Lakshanas. And when Mamsa or the Vata Lakshana, where there is a Mamsena Katina Shopaha Vivarnaha Pitikaha, wherever you have a Katina Shopa with the Vata Dushti Lakshanas with the pain, without bothering about the diagnosis, Triphala Guguli can be used as such. Or wherever you have a feature like neuritis, Harshaha Pipilekanam Santaraha Iva. Many of the patients would say that they would have a ants crawling feeling. I don't know whether those patients have read Samhita or not. Samhita has used the same word, Pipilika Iva Harshaha. Patients saying that ants crawling feeling is exactly the same. Ayurvedic students may not use that word, but patients use that word. And you have the indications in large number of conditions like tonsillitis, pharyngitis, ulcers, etc. Next part. Kankayanimity is another of the drug. Right, next. Again I consider this as a Pitta Kapahara Dravya, and wherever there is a Rakta Pitta Dushti, it can be used. It could be hemorrhoids, hypertension, cardiac myopathy like conditions, menstrual irregularities. So it's some of those indications are beyond what the text would say as the indications. Next part. So Makaradhwaja is another of the used drug where there is a Dhatukshaya Lakshanas. Dhatukshaya Lakshanas are can be seen in any disease. Any chronic disease can result in Dhatukshaya Lakshanas, but more specific will be in bronchiectasis pathologies or non-healing ulcers, spermatogenesis, abnormalities of the sperm production or so on. There again it can be used. Many times Makaradhwaja is again a misused drug. Often people have a feeling that Makaradhwaja is a aphrodisiac and it's marketed as aphrodisiac, and I have a very strong reservation about that kind of a publicity about Ayurvedic drug. Again, I will not go into the controversy. I will not make that issue as a controversial issue, but I have my reservations about publicizing about any of Ayurvedic drug in that manner and exploiting only commercially, only from the commercial point of view. I have lots of reservation about that. Next part. Abhayarishya is another of the drug. There again, it's a Tridoshahara and Rasrakta Dhatu Dushti as such. Indications could be hemorrhoids, habitual constipation, malabsorption pathologies, etc. Next. Similarly, Amritarishta, one of the another commonly used drug, is all febrile conditions it can be used. Of course, I don't have to speak about that. Amritarishta as such, in any Rasa Pradoshaja Vata or Sama Vata conditions, Amritarishta can be used. And my common prescription is rheumatism is Amritarishta, which is not the usual. Usually people use it in only Dvara, but I use it very frequently in all sorts of rheumatism conditions and with all gratifying results. Next part. Now, Ashwagandha is another of the drug where the indications could be Dhatukshaya, Agnimandya and Kaphavata Samsarga Vyadhis, where the indications which I would use would be neuritis, osteoarthritis, myositis, etc., where the patient would have a persisting variable pain with Shaitya Gaurava Shulani. That symptom of Shaitya and Gaurava, a heaviness and a cooling feeling, which is a very typical feature of the neuritis, is a definite indication for the Ashwagandha Arista as such. Next part. Similarly, Ushirasava, again it's a predominantly Raktapitta Hara Vyadhi, and wherever there is involvement of Raktapitta, it could be Raktapitta not necessarily from the nose, it could be the other way, where there is a bleeding disorder, all sorts of the bleeding disorders, metrorrhagia or urinary tract infections also, Ushirasava can be used effectively wherever there is a involvement of Pitta or the Rakta. Next, Kumariyasava, next part. The Kumariyasava is again one of the medicines which could be used in all Pitta Kaphaja Vyadhis and in malabsorption, dysmenorrhea and hepatic disorders. Kumariyasava can be used along with the other medicines as such. Next. Similarly, Khadirarishta also is a Rasarakta conditions where Raktavrata disease conditions are presented. Very preferable in case of septic foci or teniasis or anemia like conditions. Next part. Now Mustakarishta, just slip. It's again the same where you will have a Kapha Vata Dushti acid, Rasadhatu involvement and conditions like colitis, malabsorption disorders, food poisoning conditions, it can be used. I think I just referred to that issue when we discussed about the Jwara also. Right, next. Similarly, Sarasvarishta, a Medhya Rasayana, next. Where you may have the diseases like hypertension, psychiatric disorders, degenerative pathologies which could be used, which is obviously an indication for the Ojakshaya. Ojakshaya Lakshanas are all that neurotic symptoms which are seen. Right, next. Jirakadyarishta is another of the drug. Next. And I consider this as a dosha. Again, the ratio which I have given, that Vata 2 Pitta, this ratio is my experience. And I prefer this in all Pitta or the Vata conditions, and where the Shula is a Lakshana, all colic conditions, appendicitis. My prescription is same, Agnitundi Ananda Bhairavi, Jirakadyarishta is the usual prescription. We have a combination for the Doshagnata as well as the Shula, the pain as a Lakshana, as treatment, and any menstrual irregularities. These are the indications where I use the Jirakadyarishta. Next, Draksharishta, another of the yoga. Next part. It's a Pitta Vata Lakshanas, and where Rasarakta is involved, and in all patients of emaciated disorders, chronic bronchitis, neuritis conditions, anemia, the Draksharishta can be effectively used as it. So similarly, Pipalyasava, I think I referred to that when we discussed about the Kapha Jwara as such. There again, it's a Pitta Kaphaja Vyadhi. In cases like bronchitis, hemorrhoids, anemia, Pipalyasava is indicated. Right, next. Now, that's in brief about the drugs. I think I should not have taken more time. Maybe that itself could be a major issue like this issue. Another third issue is about a Shuddha Ayurveda, and I don't know what should be the other name. Is it Ashuddha Ayurveda or mixopathy or losing the identity? There are many Ayurvedic Vaidyas or Ayurvedic doctors who would hesitate to maintain that identity of Ayurveda. They would. A few of my students, I have come across few of my students who would mask their Ayurvedic identity, who would even ask like, where is the Ayurvedic college where they have studied? They do this, and they consider themselves as a very top level, high standard doctors, 3-piece suits and all that, the special appearances. But I don't consider them as a successful practitioners. The issue is the issue of that cross prescription. Making use of the other system of medicine by an Ayurvedic doctor has become a burning issue. You know about all the issues which are in the court or so on. I would have a feeling, my feeling is, you can definitely, I do use all contemporary system of medicines wherever it's necessary, but I use them only when I know about that drug, when I have studied about that drug. If you do not know about the drug, if you use that drug, that becomes a misuse. And unfortunately, next slide, there is already a burning issue. There are publications which are already present in a peer-reviewed journal. I have quoted this reference of the journal, and the title of the article is a comparative evaluation of the prescription of MBBS and BMS doctors using WHO prescribing standards. Journal references are there, published by D.Y. Patil University. And this article has a very high number of citations now, and already they have stamped that article with a popular stamp as such in the website if you see this. And the topic of that would be a comparative prescription of a BAMS doctor and MBBS doctor. The number of drugs prescribed by MBBS and BAMS comparatively, number of drugs prescribed by BAMS is more than MBBS doctors, that's what they say. But still, next slide, I have collected the information from the same, these are from the same article. The come to the third line, percentage of prescription of with antibiotics. MBBS 8.77, BAMS 82, almost 10 times. And this hurts. This definitely hurts. And as being in the field of Ayurveda for 30 years, when such a publication is there, and very unfortunately, these are the articles which are guiding our policymakers. If we go to the central government and then talk with the ministries, the health ministry table, you have this article. And when we talk about the issues, naturally they would refer to that issues. And my request, humble request is, I don't say that whether you maintain it. Now, Shuddha Ayurveda doesn't mean only using Shuddha Ayurvedic medicines alone. You may use any contemporary system of medicine. But my humble wish is, our community should have a proper guideline and should follow the guideline and never give an opportunity for that kind of a comment. I am not saying that this comment is done with jealous or a feeling. It's based upon, that article is based upon 14,000 prescriptions collected from all over India, and unfortunately, out of 14,000, 11,000 prescriptions are from Maharashtra state. So, sorry for all that. Now, I am not suggesting the issue of politics or having that difference between the states or so on, but this is the issue. And of course, the reason is, publication is from a Maharashtra university. If the publication would have been some other university, it would have been a similar issue. But is it not necessary that all of us should be bothered about that issue? One of the important concerns which we need to have, and at least this message has to be conveyed and carried by all the people who have attended this. Next part. Now similarly, of course, the same is presented in the graph, in the same article. The article has presented the issue in such a way that most of the ills of the current practice is because of these prescriptions by BAMS doctors, which may not be totally true, but it hurts. That's the point. With this, last part, I think I will conclude. Next slide. I will conclude like what Charaka has said. You may have all upayas, rutyupaya nishayaveta, but it should be dharma avirodhinaha. It should not be a contradictory to your dharma. Your dharma is the system which you have studied, and try to follow that system. That core system identity has to be maintained. Then you may use any other for Vrityupaya Nishayata. You may have any other Vrityupaya, and the important is Shamam Adhyayanam Jiva. You have to have a continuous study when you start practicing. This is for the students, not for the established practitioners. When you have started with the practice, it's not the end of your study, but that's the beginning of the study. A practitioner should be always a student. Every day you have to dedicate at least a few hours of time for the study. Then only you will become a successful practitioner as such. And at the same time, your target for the practice would be, it's not only the rich community who can pay you, it could be even the Najarogaha Nabadante Daridranapi Darunaha. Daruna Vyadhis can occur in the Daridras also, and Yat Shakyam Manushena Kartum Aushadmapadi Tatat Sevya Medha Shakti Vasanani Ashanani Cha. With your limited potentials, with your limited capabilities, you try to serve the persons who are underprivileged. And in my experience, what I have seen is treating a patient with a lower category, that's underprivileged condition, would give you more satisfaction than the rich. Rich people would have many options, and even if they are benefited, they will not have a sense of gratification. They would say, I have paid him and then he has treated. Or they would say like, all right, you have treated and I am benefited, so what should be paid for you? But a poor man, when he comes with a piece of vegetable from his garden, or some fruit he has picked up from the surrounding area, and offers at the end of the treatment and goes with a sense of gratitude, that gives you more satisfaction. And this I say after a 40 years of career. It's not the balance of money in your account which gives you satisfaction. Of course, money is necessary. Money is necessary. Money gives you a satisfaction only up to a certain limit. Beyond that, it loses the taste. So you won't have that taste. It will become now somewhat troublesome. And at times you will have always a problem with the tax calculation. When you have more balance, tax calculation is a burden. But I am not saying that you should not have a balance. You have the balance. But at the same time, try to enjoy the other aspect of life with this. Thank you. Thank you very much for being patient with me last night.